Go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to those of you that are joining us again for the session, and a special welcome to those that have joined for the first time. My session today is really about findings from webinar 3 held on the 14th of October on open learning through a new qualifications perspective. The session was well chaired by Ms. Tembisa Futshane, the DDG in the Department of Higher Education Training. And despite some difficulties of technical glitches and connectivity, she managed to introduce each speaker, highlight their expertise, and provide on-point feedback to each of them after their presentation. So thank you very much to Ms. Futshane. I'm extremely aware of the short time that I have in presenting the findings of the webinar to you, which is precisely 8 minutes, and we'll start with a brief summary of the presentations based on the current research that has been conducted, several case studies in South Africa in the area of micro-credentials and RPL. I'm going to share a few slides with you in summary of the presentations that were made. I want to quickly summarize what Chris Wolfberg shared with us on his research with composites, where he conducted research at the Mercy on micro-credentials for the advanced composites industry. Chris started by explaining how composites were actually imported into South Africa until such time that they got involved in actually manufacturing it here. And this required linking skills from the Organizing Framework of Occupations, the OFO. However, on analysis, the process was far more complicated than that. It was very complex and required an agile approach to just-in-time, just-enough, minimal viable interventions. An open badges model was used. Learning was baked into the image of the badge, and the assessment was evidence, and that the learner could combine knowledge and experience. Digital credentials were then used and can be sequenced. It's a flexible system. The industry sets the standards and the industry issues the badges. So his plea at the end of his presentation was for two things: for the NQF to make space for short skills programs as a form of flexible learning and career pathing. He proposed that the QCTO model be combined with digital badges and move away from the notion of full qualifications of 120 credits. His main recommendation was that we are progressive in how we apply digital badges in our learning systems. The second presentation, and you see it on your slide as well, was from Ms. Barbara Jones from the Northwest University. And here she discussed her research on micro-credentials and digital badges as well, but contributing how this can contribute to social justice in the higher education field. She indicated that digital badges are a subset of micro-credentials and they are issued electronically, but what was key there is how they are encrypted. So the security measures are quite clear. Her findings was that micro-credentials can be stackable, they address prior learning and can therefore address inequities of the past. And the research used the DHET policies of open learning, focused on cultural and economic inequities. They also allow for student mobility, reduce costs, and motivate students. It is a way of recognizing non-formal learning as well as CPD, continuous professional development points from professional learning. And it also allows for credit transfer between universities. Her main key point and recommendation was that university leadership take this up with mobility and trends internationally that was gained from the research, and for them to take it on as a method of operationalizing the open learning policy framework in South Africa. And she gave us a superb example of the Europass. The last presentation for that session before Sakwa came on board was from Ms. Susan Grendley, where she discussed RPL on enabling access to higher education. This was indeed an eye-opener, and despite several years of RPL projects being implemented, it still remains time-consuming, costly, and labor-intensive. The key outcome of her study was how RPL could be better implemented, well-resourced, quality-assured, and needs to be well understood as a pedagogy. She added that inclusion is not easy, and it requires a special kind of support for learners, which must be redirected into career pathing, and it is not a one-size-fits-all. The critical issue for her was funding for RPL. We then went on to a team from SAQA, and they gave us broadly inputs around the work that SAQA has been doing over the last few years, since 1998. Heidi mentioned several RPL initiatives in several sectors, at least about 10 of them, where they have been successfully implementing RPL. She made us aware of successful portfolio development course that is offered at UCT, and went through all the techniques and tools such as what was implemented at CUT, etc. And her focus was on how CAT can adopt informal learning to take on these aspects into RPL quite well. Again, Heidi as well emphasized that funding and resources were an issue. Best practice in some areas were key, while other areas in the sector were well behind with the continuation of old practices. And she really also recommended that we take best practice to scale, share good practice, and enhance communication around RPL strategies and implementation. We also then had the other staff members from SAQA, Mr. Naveen Vasudev, Japi Nell, Wellington Radu, and they all shared with us again the individual roles within SAQA and how they use some of the policies that were developed for student mobility, such as evaluation of qualifications, international liaison with SAQA, which involved a lot of research, and all this research feeds back into policy. So what did we gain overall from the webinar on the 17th? There were no surprises. We just summarized some of the conclusions that we can draw from the webinar that we've had. And we are great in South Africa on policy, but weak on implementation. And that's why I say it's no surprise. We sometimes do not have sufficient resources into what we identify as our goals within our own strategies and don't put enough funding. We have pockets of good practice, both for RPL and credentials, but we are slow to scale up these practices. And then we conduct lots of research, have many case studies, and provide evidence of sometimes what we already know, but we can't fund this research adequately. When we do fund the research, we define principles, but we do not monitor the change or the impact that it's making in our society for our citizens. So I would like to just end this brief recap with those conclusions and just probably say, which is the way to go? Let's go the credentials route, invest in our goals, scale up and be innovative. Let's open up the learning pathways and find quick wins with micro-credentials so that we can address inequity and social justice, and recognize knowledge and experience in a credible way, allow learner mobility, and keep up with international trends while we find our own solutions. So that's what I needed to share with you, and I hope that it brought together all the points that were made at the webinar, and I'm really hoping that some of these recommendations are taken up quite soon. Thank you.